Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into, well, one of the most fraught and really decisive geopolitical shifts of our time. We're looking at the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as things stand in late September 2025.
Hmm.
For decades, the whole framework, the scaffolding of international diplomacy, it rested on the idea of a two-state solution. However flawed, however distant it seemed, that was kind of the agreed-upon direction.
That was the North Star, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, that framework, it doesn't just seem stalled. It feels like it's being actively, politically, and even physically dismantled.
That's absolutely right. And our source material for this deep dive, it's really a collection of reports, analyses, political statements, all mapping out Israel's current strategic thinking. And that goal seems pretty clear now: indefinite security dominance.
Right.
While at the same time explicitly rejecting any real pathway to Palestinian statehood. And this just raises a huge question, doesn't it? What are the implications, immediate and long-term, of essentially trading that idea of a negotiated political settlement for permanent military security control?
Yeah, that's the core of it. So our mission here, for you listening, is to try and get beyond just the headlines. We need to distill this incredibly complex status quo, really analyze Prime Minister Netanyahu's no state west of the Jordan doctrine.
Which is quite a statement.
It is. And crucially, understand the profound social, military, legal crises this new, very hardline trajectory is imposing, not just on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but also on Arab citizens within Israel itself. It feels like a definitive break from decades of diplomacy.
It really does.
So we need to understand what this new political endgame, this military endgame, actually looks like on the ground.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, the whole regional environment, from the diplomatic fallout to the really entrenched humanitarian crisis, it's all now operating under this assumption of permanence. This is the new reality, at least for now.
So where do we start?
We absolutely have to start with the event that really acted as the catalyst for this shift, an event whose scale just caught almost everyone completely by surprise: the October 7th, 2023 attacks.
Okay, October 7th. The attack, codenamed Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, wasn't just another round of rocket fire, was it? It was something fundamentally different, an unprecedented, highly coordinated, multi-pronged surprise assault launched by Hamas and allied militant groups from Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe detail the sheer scope of that operation?
Certainly. I mean, it really demonstrated a level of planning and, frankly, audacity that just shattered all previous assumptions about Hamas capabilities and, perhaps more importantly, their intentions. We're talking massive ground incursions, obviously, but also the shock elements, militants using everything from, paragliders, which let them bypass sophisticated border defenses just by flying low, to motorcycles, speedboats. It was multifaceted.
And the border itself.
The border, yeah, which Israel had invested billions in, relied on for years. The sources confirm it was breached in, believe it or not, over 100 locations, a total system failure, really.
The human cost was just immediate and horrific.
Yeah.
It marks the single deadliest day for Israel since its founding, is that right?
Yeah. It was catastrophic, utterly catastrophic. Sources generally place the final death toll around 11,195, and that figure includes both civilians and security forces.
Mm-hmm.
And this number encompasses the mass killings, most infamously at the Supernova Music Festival near Riyadh, where hundreds of young people were just gunned down, and also in the Kibbutzim, places like Be'eri.
Just awful scenes.
Terrible. And beyond the sheer number killed, dozens, maybe hundreds of individuals, and numbers are still debated, were taken back into Gaza as hostages. And the fate, the recovery of those remaining hostages, that continues to be a huge operational and political constraint on Israel's military strategy, even now in late 2025.
What's so, puzzling, I suppose, is the intelligence failure. Israel has this reputation, right? Renowned intelligence capabilities, Mossad, Shin Bet.
Mm. Yet they were apparently caught completely flat-footed. How did that happen? Why the total collapse? It's a really critical question. And the analysis suggests it wasn't just a simple failure of, gathering data. It seems to have been a profound systemic failure of interpretation, rooted in what analysts often call cognitive bias.
Okay, cognitive bias. What does that mean in this context?
It means Israeli intelligence actually had indications. There was surveillance data, intercepted communications, reports of unusual training exercises, things that suggested something big was brewing. But the officials making the assessments, they suffered from this over-reliance on a deeply entrenched assumption.
Which was?
The belief, essentially, that the combination of Economic incentives offered to Gazan workers crossing into Israel, plus Israel's overwhelming military deterrence. That this combination had basically extinguished Hamas's willingness to risk an all-out existential fight. They thought Hamas was deterred.
So they kind of believed their own narrative, victims of their own perceived success, maybe, believing in their own impenetrable system.
That seems to be a big part of it, exactly.
Yeah.
They prioritized what they believed Hamas would do, which was, maintain the status quo for political survival, manage Gaza over what the raw intelligence showed Hamas was capable of preparing for. Plus, there seems to have been an operational bias, too. They'd invested so heavily in that multi-billion-dollar anti-tunnel barrier, the electronic surveillance along the border, maybe trusting technology a bit too much over traditional human intelligence gathering. And that proved to be a fatal miscalculation.
Right.
So key warnings were apparently dismissed or maybe misinterpreted as just, local incidents exercises, not precursors to a massive coordinated assault. And then you add failures in communication, coordination on the ground, which led to that disastrously slow mobilization of troops into the southern towns in those critical first hours.
The cascade of failures.
A cascade, precisely.
Before we move on from October 7th, there's this really unique, almost strange symbolic factor mentioned in our sources. The red heifer. Why on earth did Hamas specifically cite this religious symbol in their justification for the attack? It sounds, well, almost esoteric.
It is deeply esoteric, but that's also what makes it politically potent, particularly in this context. So the red heifer in Jewish tradition is required for a specific ritual purification ceremony, and this purification is considered necessary by some religious groups for the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
And the Third Temple would stand on the Temple Mount.
Exactly. On the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is, of course, revered by Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, it's perhaps the most sensitive religious site on earth.
So the mere presence of these animals, which were imported and being prepared by certain religious Jewish groups, was framed by Hamas as a direct physical threat to Muslim holy sites.
Precisely. Hamas spokespersons explicitly framed the transfer of these heifers and the associated religious activity around them not as some minor peripheral thing, but as one of the primary provocations that justified the October 7th operation.
Wow.
For Hamas, the symbolism provided an incredibly powerful religious narrative. It cast the operation as a defense of Al-Aqsa. It added this layer of religious urgency to the existing political and operational justifications, like the ongoing blockade of Gaza or settlement expansion in the West Bank. It elevates the conflict in their rhetoric from just a territorial dispute to something more like an existential religious struggle over sacred space.
That's a really critical distinction to understand. It shows how religious rhetoric, even seemingly obscure symbols, can be weaponized to accelerate a conflict that already have these deep political and territorial roots. The symbolic element isn't just some weird footnote. It acts as an amplifier for those deeper substantive causes, the grinding blockade, the relentless expansion of settlements, and, as we just discussed, the ultimate failure of Israel's long-term deterrence strategy.
Okay, so moving from the immediate aftermath and the attack itself to the longer-term policy response. The trajectory articulated by the Israeli government, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, has really solidified. It's hardened into a doctrine that seems to unequivocally reject those previous peace frameworks we talked about.
So what are the definitive goals Israel is pursuing now, as we see things in late 2025?
Yeah.
What's the official line?
Well, the policy really represents a strategic shift towards unilateral security control. The stated goals seem pretty clear. First, assert indefinite security dominance over Gaza, whatever that looks like day to day.
Control.
Second, dismantle Hamas entirely. And not just as a fighting force, but also dismantle its political capacity, its ability to govern. And third, and this is the big one, actively block any and all pathways to a sovereign Palestinian state. This last point really marks the formal death of the two-state solution, at least as far as official Israeli policy is concerned right now.
And this wasn't just hinted at, was it? It wasn't sort of background noise. It was declared quite explicitly in September 2025.
Oh, it was the defining political statement of this era, arguably. On September 21st, 2025, Netanyahu declared, quote, "There will be no Palestinian state west of the Jordan River," end quote.
Wow. Just point blank.
Point blank. And think about the timing. This declaration came right after several key allies, countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, had actually moved to formally recognize Palestinian statehood.
So it was a direct rebuttal.
It felt like a deliberate frontal rejection of that growing international consensus, or at least trend. This doctrine clearly prioritizes maximum security control, as defined by Israel, and ideological claims over any kind of political compromise or accommodation with Palestinian national aspirations.
This sounds less like, planning for some future peace, however distant, and
Yeah.
more like managing a permanent, maybe low-grade, but ongoing conflict. Our sources talk about this as the forever war scenario.
Mm.
What are the sort of mechanisms that enable this kind of indefinite conflict model?
Yeah, that forever war framing used by institutions like CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is a really critical analytical point.
Yeah.
This model implies maintaining a semi-permanent, maybe even permanent military presence, engaging in cyclical counterinsurgency operations going in, degrading capabilities, pulling back slightly, then going back in again, all without addressing the underlying political grievances or despair.
Sounds familiar from other conflicts.
It does. They draw explicit analogies to the long, costly, and ultimately unresolved conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, military domination without resolving the root causes, the mechanisms sustaining it. Well, massive, sustained military expenditure is one. You see reservists constantly being mobilized, that the defense budget has spiked significantly.
Right.
And it involves a strategy of localized suppression, keeping a lid on things, without any overarching political framework for eventual withdrawal or Palestinian self-determination.
The economic cost, the human cost, just maintaining that kind of posture, both for Israel and obviously for the Palestinians. It must feel unsustainable in the long run, surely.
Well, it's certainly economically burdensome for Israel, and it's politically divisive domestically. You can see that in protests and debates. But crucially, the current political momentum, especially within the governing coalition, strongly supports it. And this policy isn't just rhetoric. It's enforced physically on the ground through continuous settlement expansion. That's the physical manifestation of the doctrine.
The settlements.
Yes. The government has been aggressively approving thousands of new housing units in the West Bank, often targeting strategically sensitive geographical areas.
Okay, let's focus on those areas mentioned in the sources. E1 and the Jordan Valley. Why are they so strategically critical to this whole doctrine?
Right. E1, or East 1, is arguably the most sensitive flashpoint. It's this strip of land just northeast of Jerusalem, building Israeli settlements there, which essentially involved linking the massive existing settlement of Ma'al Adumim directly to Jerusalem. Well, it effectively severs the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank.
Cuts it in half.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If E1 is fully built out, it makes the idea of a contiguous Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem physically impossible. And it fragments the entire West Bank territory into these, well, non-viable, disconnected urban enclaves or cantons.
So it's basically geographic engineering, designed specifically to prevent the physical possibility of a coherent, contiguous Palestinian state ever forming.
That appears to be the strategic logic, precisely. And this strategy is being pushed even further by right-wing partners in the coalition. They're not just content with controlling the territory, they're actively pushing for outright annexation of large parts of the West Bank.
Especially Area C.
Especially Area C, yes, which constitutes about 60% of the territory. They justify this based on, historical and ideological claims, viewing Judea and Samaria, as they call it, as non-negotiable ancestral Jewish land. So the pressure is towards formalizing that control into sovereignty.
Meanwhile, you have countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, major Western allies formally recognizing Palestinian statehood. Israel must be facing pretty serious international isolation over this, right? Yet the government seems completely undeterred.
The diplomatic costs are significant, no doubt. It contributes to growing global criticism, UN resolutions, even potential legal challenges at international bodies like the ICJ or ICC. However, up to this point, Israel has remained largely defiant of calls from the US, the EU, the UN to halt settlement expansion or change course.
Why? What's driving that defiance?
The sources really emphasize that this defiance is fueled by strong domestic political currents. For the current government, and for a significant portion of the Israeli public, prioritizing what they define as absolute security, preventing what they see as a potentially hostile state emerging right on their borders, is a political winner. It trumps international condemnation. It's a strategy where internal security calculations and ideological commitment are overriding concerns about external diplomatic stability or alliances. Okay, let's shift our focus back specifically to Gaza. Even with this explicit goal of, achieving total victory and indefinite control, the reality on the ground, nearly 2 years into major operations, demonstrates something else. It shows that while military capture of territory is possible, the full elimination of Hamas as a political force, as a fighting entity, that's proving exceptionally difficult. It's fraught with political, social, and, moral complexities.
So why the continued refusal by Hamas to just surrender, even facing this unprecedented scale of destruction in Gaza?
Their refusal seems rooted in some pretty deep ideological and strategic realities. First, you have the ideological commitment. For the Hamas leadership, this struggle is existential. Surrender would mean the ultimate abandonment of their core charter, their raison d'etre, and probably their perceived popular legitimacy as the main resistance movement.
They see themselves as the resistance.
Exactly. Second, the hostages. Those remaining hostages are still critical strategic leverage. They allow Hamas to demand things, ceasefires, however temporary, humanitarian aid corridors, maybe massive prisoner exchanges like we saw earlier. And third, perhaps most importantly, there's this deep entrenched distrust of Israel based on past experiences. Meaning they look back at past negotiations, ceasefires, temporary pauses, and from their perspective, these didn't yield long-term political change or any real relief from the blockade. They seem to believe that if they surrender now, they face total annihilation without achieving any concessions whatsoever. So fighting on, however costly, is seen as the only way to exert pressure.
That cycle of distrust just fuels the continued fighting. And the fighting itself is uniquely difficult because of the environment, isn't it? The sheer urban density of Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. That urban density is a massive force multiplier for any defending force, especially an irregular one. When militants and civilians are tragically so densely interspersed, conventional military operations, airstrikes, artillery, ground incursions inevitably lead to incredibly high civilian casualties.
Which then feeds the next cycle.
Precisely. It feeds the cycle of resentment, anger, and potentially radicalization. And it forces the attacking military, in this case the IDF, into these slow, painstaking, and highly controversial forms of urban warfare that draw intense international scrutiny.
And underpinning all of this is the tunnel network. It remains the defining feature of this conflict, doesn't it?
It really does. That subterranean infrastructure, often called the Gaza Metro, is the strategic heart of Hamas's resilience. It serves multiple vital functions: command and control centers hidden deep underground, weapons caches, logistical smuggling routes for supplies, and maybe most critically, pathways for fighters to launch surprise attacks and then disappear.
Even with Israel's anti-tunnel barrier along the border.
Right. Israel built that sophisticated, expensive barrier along the border. But neutralizing the vast network of tunnels inside Gaza itself requires different tactics. It means slow, incredibly dangerous, and very expensive operations, finding tunnel shafts, mapping the network, clearing them, destroying them, often involving specialized engineering units and robotics, facing the constant threat of ambushes and booby traps.
And Hamas has adapted its tactics too, presumably.
Oh, definitely. The complexity is compounded by Hamas's apparent shift towards more classic asymmetric guerrilla tactics. Things like well-placed snipers, extensive use of booby traps in buildings and tunnels, deadly IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These tactics are highly effective in dense, rubble-strewn urban environments, like the refugee camps, Jabalia, Shujaiya, places we've seen intense fighting. And they inflict a heavy, sustained toll on conventional forces trying to clear and hold ground.
Let's just underscore the human cost of this grinding, seemingly endless quagmire by late 2025. What are the humanitarian reports actually telling us?
The numbers are just devastating, and they represent a scale of destruction rarely seen in modern conflict zones. Reports generally indicate well over 40,000 deaths in Gaza since October 2023. The true number is likely higher, but verification is incredibly difficult.
And displacement.
Mass displacement is staggering. Over 80% of Gaza's population, that's nearly 1.9 million people, have been forced from their homes, many multiple times. They're living in makeshift shelters, tents, overcrowded schools or hospitals, often lacking basic necessities.
And the physical destruction.
Satellite analysis paints a chilling picture. Estimates suggest that roughly 60% of all buildings in Gaza, including residential towers, homes, schools, mosques, hospitals, critical infrastructure, were damaged or completely destroyed by mid-2025. This massive infrastructural collapse does more than just cause an immediate humanitarian crisis. It obliterates the very foundations of a viable, self-sustaining community for the future. And that, in turn, just fuels despair and resentment.
It's hard to fathom, given this enormous cost, this level of suffering, why does Hamas's popularity, or at least its perceived legitimacy as a resistance force, seem to persist among a significant segment of the Palestinian population?
It seems to boil down to a few key factors. One is symbolism. For many Palestinians, especially in the absence of a credible peace process, Hamas is viewed as the only entity willing and able, however brutally, to physically resist the occupation and what they perceive as decades of injustice.
The only ones fighting back.
In their eyes, yes. The second factor is the vacuum of political alternatives. There's a deep historical disillusionment with past peace processes that led nowhere. There's widespread frustration, according to polls, with the perceived inefficacy, or sometimes corruption, of the Palestinian Authority, PA, based in the West Bank.
Right.
So, in that vacuum, Hamas's narrative of armed resistance resonates powerfully, even among people who don't necessarily support their Islamist ideology or tactics. Polling, though difficult and variable, consistently suggests that approval for, or at least support of, Hamas, while it fluctuates, remains surprisingly strong, maybe around 40% in various contexts.
So military force alone isn't enough.
It's a crucial indicator that military force alone, however overwhelming, seems insufficient to eradicate the underlying ideological commitment or the political appeal of resistance, especially when there's no viable political horizon offered. The sheer scale of destruction and the lack of any positive future prospect almost guarantees that the next generation will also see resistance, perhaps in new forms, as their only perceived option.
Okay, to really grasp this policy of permanent control, we absolutely have to clarify the legal landscape. It's complicated, but crucial. The territories we're talking about, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, are overwhelmingly classified by international bodies, the UN, the ICJ, most countries, as occupied territories under international law stemming from the 1967 war?
That's the dominant international legal consensus, yes. Though Israel disputes this classification, often preferring terms like disputed territory, particularly for the West Bank. But terminology aside, the core problem remains the same. Millions of Palestinians living in these areas are effectively stateless.
Stateless. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means they lack the full legal protection, the rights, the sovereignty that come with citizenship in a recognized independent state. The very existence of UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, highlights this. Roughly 5 million Palestinians worldwide are registered as refugees with UNRWA, underscoring this protracted state of statelessness, often spanning generations.
And UNRWA itself has become a real political football lately, hasn't it? Its funding, its mandate.
Absolutely. UNRWA is now a major site of international political conflict. There have been significant efforts, particularly from Israel and some allies, to defund or even dismantle the agency. These efforts often cite allegations of political bias, mismanagement, or alleged links between some staff and militant groups.
What's the significance of that fight over UNRWA?
Well, it's hugely significant because UNRWA provides essential services, education, healthcare, social support that a functioning Palestinian state would normally provide. So attempts to delegitimize or dismantle UNRWA are often interpreted by Palestinians and their supporters as part of a larger strategy.
The strategy, too.
A strategy to undermine the very concept of the Palestinian right of return, which is a core political demand, and to erode the legal and institutional framework that supports these stateless refugees. Essentially, critics argue, it aims to make their displacement and confinement permanent, rather than a temporary situation pending a political solution.
Okay, let's break down the West Bank specifically. The Oslo Accords, back in the 90s, created this really complex system of fragmentation. It means daily life, your rights, your restrictions depend radically on exactly where you live. Right?
Radically different, yes. The Oslo structure divided the West Bank into 3 administrative categories. You have Area A, which is about 18% of the land, covering the major Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin. Theoretically, this is under full Palestinian Authority, civil and security control. Theoretically. Then there's Area B, about 22%. Here, the PA has civil control schools, hospitals, municipal services, but security control is joint between the PA and the Israeli military. This means the IDF can, and frequently does, conduct security operations, arrests, raids within Area B.
Okay, which leaves Area C. That's the big one, 60% of the territory. And this seems the most critical for understanding Israel's long-term strategy of control.
Absolutely. Area C is under full Israeli civil and military control. This is the contiguous territory that surrounds Areas A and B. It contains almost all Israeli settlements, strategic land reserves, military bases, main roads connecting settlements, and most of the territory's natural resources, like water aquifers.
And what's life like for Palestinians living in Area C?
They face the most severe restrictions by far. For instance, getting a building permit from the Israeli authorities to build or even renovate a Palestinian home in Area C is notoriously difficult, bordering on impossible. Sources suggest approvals are granted for less than 2% of Palestinian applications annually.
2%.
Which leads to thousands of Palestinian structures, homes, sheds, animal pens, even schools being designated unauthorized and subject to demolition orders. Reports indicate these demolitions often exceed 2,000 structures annually. Meanwhile, settlement construction in the same Area C proceeds rapidly, often with government subsidies and infrastructure support. This stark disparity is really the engine driving that geographic fragmentation we talked about.
And then there's East Jerusalem. That adds another whole layer of legal complexity, almost a paradox.
It really is a paradox. You have around 350,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, which Israel annexed shortly after the '67 war, an annexation not recognized internationally. These Palestinians generally hold Israeli permanent residency status.
Sounds okay, but
It's a precarious status. It allows them access to Israeli municipal services, healthcare, social security, which is often better than in the West Bank. However, it's a revocable status. It can be withdrawn under certain conditions, like living abroad for too long or acquiring foreign citizenship. Crucially, they are not full Israeli citizens unless they apply for citizenship.
And do they apply?
Historically, very few have applied. Often for political reasons, applying could be seen as implicitly accepting Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, which goes against the Palestinian national consensus that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a future Palestinian state. So they exist in this legal limbo, residents, paying taxes, often voting in municipal elections, but not for the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. They're caught straddling this deep political and legal divide.
Okay, now looking at Gaza. Even before the massive escalation post-October 7th, the territory was largely defined by the blockade, right? Economic and human isolation.
Absolutely. Since Hamas took de facto control in Gaza back in 2007, ejecting the PA, the territory has been under a tight air, land, and sea blockade, primarily maintained by Israel, but also significantly controlled by Egypt at the southern Rafah border.
So while Hamas handled internal administration,
Yes, running ministries, police forces, courts, Israel controlled almost all external aspects. Airspace, entry and exit of goods, movement of people, coastal waters, the population registry. This external control severely limits Gaza's economic viability, access to raw materials, exports, and basic freedom of movement for its population. It ensures that even if Hamas were somehow completely removed tomorrow, Gaza would still lack the fundamental attributes of sovereignty and self-determination without a change in that external control regime.
and all these legal statuses, these restrictions, they translate directly into those dire humanitarian realities we discussed earlier, don't they?
Directly. Movement, both internally within the West Bank, due to checkpoints, roadblocks, the separation barrier, and externally out of both the West Bank and Gaza, is heavily controlled. It relies on an often opaque and difficult Israeli permit system, especially at crossing points like Erez for Gaza or Allenby Bridge for the West Bank to Jordan.
These permits are hard to get.
Very hard. Often delayed indefinitely or denied based on vague security pretexts. This restricts everything. Family visits between Gaza and the West Bank, students accessing universities, patients seeking specialized medical treatment outside the territories, traders moving goods. The humanitarian consequences are stark. We mentioned the food insecurity sources show 70% of Gazan households facing acute food insecurity, even before the latest escalation, largely due to the blockade. And that crisis has been massively exacerbated by the severe curtailment of humanitarian aid access since the major conflict intensified. This intricate system of control over movement and daily life is absolutely central to maintaining that policy of indefinite security dominance.
Okay, given these increasing military pressures, the legal restrictions, and especially the sheer collapse of basic infrastructure in Gaza, some critics and analysts, as mentioned in our sources, describe Israel's overall policy approach as fostering something called demographic engineering by attrition. That's a pretty loaded term. What does it actually mean in this context?
It is a loaded term, and it's important to define it carefully. It describes a mechanism of gradual erosion, making life so difficult that people leave over time. It's distinct from, say, a formal policy of mass expulsion or transfer, which is illegal under international law and would provoke massive international outcry.
So it's more subtle.
It's argued to be more subtle, yes. Attrition in this framing means rendering life in certain areas, particularly Area C of the West Bank, or perhaps now large parts of Gaza, so difficult, so economically unviable, so physically insecure through things like military operations, movement restrictions, lack of services, persistent home demolitions, that residents feel gradually pressured to leave those specific areas.
Pushing them where?
The effect, critics argue, is to push Palestinians into ever smaller, more isolated, densely packed urban enclaves. Think of the main cities in Area A, like Ramallah or Nablus, or the overcrowded southern parts of Gaza now. These areas become increasingly surrounded by Israeli settlements, military zones, restricted roads. The argument is that this gradually reduces the viable Palestinian territorial footprint over time, making a future state geographically impossible without ever needing a formal expulsion order.
So if people do want to leave these incredibly dire conditions, escape the constant military pressure or lack of future prospects, what are their actual practical pathways for external migration? Are there legal ways out?
The pathways are deliberately kept very narrow and are legally quite fraught. Historically, Jordan has been the primary refuge for Palestinians, particularly after 1948 and 1967. Jordan currently hosts nearly 2.5 million registered Palestinian refugees.
But your status in Jordan isn't uniform, right?
Not at all. It's complex and largely tied to their family's origin. Generally speaking, those whose families originated in the West Bank before the 1967 occupation often possess full Jordanian citizenship, granting them rights and mobility. But the vast majority of those whose families originated from areas that became Israel in 1948, or, crucially, from the Gaza Strip, are often denied full Jordanian citizenship. They remain registered refugees, often living in camps with limited rights and opportunities, effectively stateless within Jordan.
Okay, so Jordan is complicated. What about Egypt? For Gazans, the Rafah crossing into Egypt is technically the only other land border out.
Rafah is absolutely the essential choke point for Gazans wanting to leave, but it is very tightly controlled by Cairo. Egypt has been extremely consistent in rejecting any proposal, whether floated by Israeli politicians or others, to relocate large numbers of Gazans into the Sinai Peninsula next door.
Why is Egypt so resistant?
Cairo cites several major reasons. Serious security concerns are primary. They fear militant infiltration from Gaza into the Sinai, where Egypt has fought its own insurgency for years. They also have deep domestic political and economic concerns about absorbing potentially hundreds of thousands or even millions of refugees. And there's a strong pan-Arab political stance against facilitating what they see as the emptying of Palestine. They've even physically reinforced their border with Gaza recently, building buffer zones and walls. So any movement out via Rafah is highly restricted, mostly limited to small groups, maybe dual nationals, urgent medical cases, sometimes students or professionals, often requiring permits, coordination, and sometimes significant fees. It's definitely not an open door for mass migration.
Okay, so neighboring countries are largely closed off or restricted. What if a typical Palestinian resident, say in the West Bank or Gaza, wants to move further afield to Europe, the Gulf, North America? It's not just about getting a visa from the destination country, is it?
Yeah.
What are the obstacles on the departure side?
No, it's incredibly complex, far beyond just getting a foreign visa. First, as stateless people, many Palestinians rely on travel documents issued either by the PA or other host countries like Egypt or Jordan. Obtaining and renewing these can be difficult and bureaucratic. Second, even if they secure a foreign visa, they still typically require permission from Israeli authorities to exit the West Bank or Gaza.
Israel controls the exit points.
Exactly. Israel controls a population registry for Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza, and controls all border crossings out, except Rafah, which requires Egyptian consent too. Exit permits can be denied for security reasons, often without detailed explanation. Third, the cost is often prohibitive. Legal migration pathways usually require significant financial resources, which most Palestinians, especially in Gaza, simply don't have.
So what are the options for those without resources?
For those without the means for illegal migration, which often involves those seeking high-skilled jobs in Gulf states like the UAE or Qatar, the remaining options are incredibly dangerous. We're talking about relying on smugglers, attempting perilous journeys often across the Mediterranean Sea towards Europe. Our sources indicate that well over 2,000 irregular migration attempts across the sea alone have been recorded since 2018, and that's likely an undercount. It just underscores the high-risk, desperate reality for those trying to escape.
Given the danger, the daily hardship, the lack of future, the pressure to leave must be immense. Yet you also hear about this powerful desire to remain, the concept of sumud, steadfastness. What's the general sentiment on the ground, according to sources?
It seems to be a profound internal conflict for many. You see polling reflecting this. One 2025 survey found that nearly half of Gazans, 49%, said they would apply to emigrate if they were allowed to. That shows the sheer desperation created by the conditions.
But the other half?
But the other half, and perhaps many within that 49% too, express incredibly deep ties to their ancestral land, a powerful sense of identity rooted in place. There's a refusal to give a political victory to those who might want them gone. And there's a deep historical fear of permanent displacement, echoing the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. Many are unwilling to abandon their homes and heritage even under the most dire circumstances. So at the end of the day, the overwhelming barriers, their statelessness, the prohibitive costs, the tight border controls enforced by Israel and neighboring Arab states mean that despite the despair and the desire some might have to leave, most Palestinians remain effectively confined within this geography of control. And finally, to really complete the picture, we have to look at the internal component of this complex reality. We need to talk about the contested position of Arab citizens of Israel.
Right. These are Palestinian Arabs who remained within the borders of what became Israel after the 1948 war and their descendants.
Exactly. They constitute a significant minority, about 21% of Israel's total population today. That's around 2 million people.
And legally, their situation is completely different from Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza, isn't it? They hold full Israeli citizenship.
That's the crucial legal distinction, yes. They have full legal citizenship. They have the right to vote in national elections. They have representation in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. I think there were 15 Arab members elected in 2022. They generally live within Israel proper, the Green Line, and most are exempt from mandatory military service, though some Bedouin and others do volunteer.
So, legally citizens. Yet the sources consistently point to profound systemic disadvantages and inequalities they face. What are the key elements driving that?
Right. While they are full legal citizens on paper, their lived experience is often characterized by significant systemic inequality. This has become particularly pronounced, many argue, since the passage of the controversial 2018 nation-state law.
Yes, the nation-state law. What did that do specifically?
Well, it formally enshrined Israel in its quasi-constitutional basic laws as the nation-state of the Jewish people. This had several effects. It affirmed Jewish symbols, Jewish calendar, Jewish holidays as official. It also controversially downgraded the status of Arabic from an official language to one with just a special status. And critically, it stated that the realization of national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people.
How did that impact Arab citizens practically, beyond the symbolic downgrading of Arabic?
Critics, like the legal center Adala, argue that it provided a constitutional anchor for policies that prioritize Jewish citizens and communities over Arab ones. For example, the law explicitly states that Israel views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation.
So it potentially provides legal cover for discrimination in areas like land allocation.
That's the argument. That the law, used in conjunction with other planning and budget laws, contributes to the systemic underfunding and neglect of Arab towns and cities, restricts their ability to expand, and facilitates the allocation of state land primarily for Jewish development. It creates this legal paradox where Arab citizens have equal voting rights, but arguably not equal national rights or belonging within the state's defining character.
And the economic disparities reflect this. They seem huge.
The statistics are pretty stark and persistent. The poverty rate among Arab citizens consistently hovers around 36%, which is roughly double the rate for Jewish Israelis, around 18%. Average household income for Arab families is roughly half that of Jewish households.
Wow.
And much of this is linked to those housing and land issues we mentioned. Arab towns and villages often face chronic overcrowding, lack of infrastructure investment, and restrictive zoning policies that make legal expansion incredibly difficult, even to accommodate natural population growth.
This also ties into the issue of the unrecognized villages, particularly in the Negev desert, right?
Exactly. This is a major ongoing issue. There are tens of thousands of Bedouin Arabs living in the Negev region in villages that the state of Israel does not officially recognize, even though many predate the state itself.
Unrecognized means?
It means they're essentially off the grid. They lack basic state-provided infrastructure, no connection to the national electricity grid, no official water supply, no sewerage systems, often no paved roads or recognized schools within the village. And because they're unrecognized, any structure built there is considered illegal. This leads to that high rate of home demolitions we talked about earlier, affecting thousands of structures annually, fueling deep bitterness and cycles of poverty and exclusion.
Given this backdrop of legal citizenship combined with systemic inequality and a contested national identity, how do Arab citizens generally navigate their own identity? Do they primarily see themselves as Israeli or as Palestinian?
Their identity is, understandably, very complex and often contested, both internally and externally. While they participate in Israeli society and its democratic processes, polls consistently show that their primary self-identification is overwhelmingly Palestinian or Arab. One poll from 2024 indicated that only about 23% identified primarily as Israeli.
Only 23%.
Right. Most identify as Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Israeli Arabs, or simply Palestinian. They exist as this internal national minority, often feeling caught between their civic reality as Israeli citizens and their national and cultural identity as Palestinians. Many describe feeling like second-class citizens in the only country they've ever known.
And the political climate since October 7th, 2023? That must have only amplified these tensions and feelings of exclusion, correct?
Yeah. Immensely. The sources report that the post-October 7th climate has been marked by a significant chilling effect, heightened scrutiny, and even political suppression directed at Arab citizens. There are widespread reports of workplace discrimination, increased police monitoring, and a surge in arrests or disciplinary actions over social media posts deemed sympathetic to Gazans or critical of Israel's actions, even if non-violent.
People feel less safe.
Definitely. One recent survey cited showed that 60%, a clear majority of Arab citizens, reported feeling less safe expressing their identity or political views publicly since the conflict began. This intense political pressure and feeling of being under suspicion has also led to growing disillusionment with the political system. This is reflected, for instance, in declining voter turnout in national elections. It dropped to just 42% in the 2022 election. Many seem to feel that their political participation yields diminishing returns, especially since Arab political parties, even when they gain seats, are almost always excluded from forming ruling government coalitions. #outro. So where does this leave us? When we try to synthesize this whole picture, this deep dive into the sources as of late 2025, what's the overall trajectory? Well, the Israeli strategy seems explicitly, deliberately built on achieving and maintaining long-term security control while actively preventing Palestinian sovereignty. It's enforced through mechanisms like geographical fragmentation in the West Bank, the ongoing situation in Gaza, legal attrition, and maintaining control over borders and movement. The policy seems to have moved decisively beyond just managing the occupation. It feels like it's actively entrenching a permanent one-state reality, but a reality defined by absolute Israeli dominance and institutionalized Palestinian statelessness and confinement.
And the inevitable outcome, based on everything we've looked at in the source material, it really appears to be this grinding, deeply entrenched status quo. A kind of perpetual low-intensity conflict marked by these recurring cycles of intense violence, followed by periods of simmering tension, all overlaid by a deep, chronic humanitarian crisis, particularly in Gaza. And crucially, with virtually no clear diplomatic resolution even on the distant horizon, the political concessions that would be needed from Israel for any kind of viable two-state solution, they're now viewed by the dominant political forces within Israel as fundamentally incompatible with their definition of national security.
And what's so, fascinating isn't quite the right word, but striking here is this collision. You have the military pursuit of total victory, a very difficult concept against a decentralized ideological foe like Hamas, crashing against the hard demographic and political reality of an ongoing conflict. A conflict rooted in decades, even centuries, of historical claims, national identity, and deep ideological commitment on both sides. The sheer level of destruction in Gaza, the hardening of positions regarding the West Bank settlements, it means the internal pressures on both sides make compromise incredibly difficult to sell politically. You have the Israeli right viewing any significant diplomatic pullback or settlement freeze as betrayal. You have Hamas, or whatever succeeds it, likely viewing surrender or disarmament as existential defeat. It leaves almost no room for maneuver.
So here's where it gets really interesting and maybe deeply troubling. Given this depth of entanglement, we've spent this time detailing the legal barriers, the geographical facts on the ground, the hardened ideological positions that have been constructed. What kind of scenario, however unlikely it might seem right now, would actually be required to fundamentally reshape this playing field? Because the current path seems to guarantee nothing but permanent instability for everyone involved.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We can only really project based on the constraints and trends we've observed in the sources. Drastic shifts seem unlikely without major external factors changing.
So, thinking provocatively for you, the listener, unless there's some kind of significant external intervention, Maybe a dramatic, fundamental U.S. policy reversal after the 2026 midterm elections, perhaps. Or maybe some unforeseen, region-wide diplomatic breakthrough, maybe orchestrated by key Arab nations finally deciding the status quo is too dangerous. Barring something like that, how long can this strategy of absolute control without sovereignty, this managed instability, actually persist before it reaches some kind of absolute breaking point, a point that forces not just Israel and the Palestinians, but all the regional and international powers to completely redefine the political terms of engagement? That is the core unanswered question that seems to define this historical moment, and it's one you'll need to keep asking as you watch events unfold.